Welcome to Improve Your English Writing, video number 48, where I'll be discussing the spacing of punctuation. And specifically, I'll be covering spacing with periods, question marks, and exclamation marks, Rule 54, spacing with commas, colons, and semicolons, Rule 55, and spacing with dashes, slashes, and hyphens, Rule 56. And spacing with quotation marks, parentheses, and brackets, Rule 57. If you'd like to get notifications for this series, please click subscribe. If you like the video or you think others will find it useful, please click like. And check out links to books and videos in the description, like a link to the companion volume here, Improve Your English Writing. So let's get on to rule number 54. Spacing with the periods, question marks, and exclamation marks. So the rule is use no space before and one space after a period, question mark, or exclamation mark. So no space before, so it's word, then directly after it, period, question mark, or exclamation mark, and then you put one space after it. And I have bolded one. In the past, people would write two spaces after period. That has not been in use for at least 10 years. So it's one space after a period. That's probably a common question. It is one space after a period. And it's one space after a question mark, exclamation mark. So some exceptions to these rules are no space after the above punctuation marks when it is directly followed by a closing parentheses or closing quotation mark. So basically no space after period, question mark, or exclamation mark when a closing parentheses or closing quotation mark follows. And no space after a decimal point. So let's look at some examples. And all the ones that, I've highlighted and read all the ones that are applicable to the current rule. I think I might have put, if it's a punctuation mark which doesn't apply to the current rule, I think I might have put it in purple. We'll see. See if my memory is good. So I fell asleep in the afternoon sun. This is into one sentence, so it's no space, period, and then one space, and then I routinely forgot sunblock back then. So period, there's no space before the period. And remember, after closing, if a closing parentheses follow, no space. So I do want to say that all the examples, it's good to actually maybe watch this video and go back through the examples, because here I'm actually using parentheses, but I won't cover parentheses until like 3 more rules, but you can actually see how I used parentheses correctly in this example, but I haven't highlighted it because I haven't gone to that rule. So it's good to come back to these. And so if you're wondering if you want some more examples of spacing with punctuation, just run back through the examples again, because you can actually see how I've used other punctuation marks. So, but here I'm just focusing on the period, question mark, and exclamation mark. This example is the bus had a flat tire. So exclamation point, so no space before, one space after. Did the children arrive at school on time? Question mark. So once again, no space before, one space after. No. So, like even though I'm not commenting on the comma, so you can actually see how the spacing is with the comma in the next rule, but here I'm not highlighting it. No, they did not. Period. So no space before, one space after. The bus arrived at 9:30 a.m. Just a note, only one space ends a sentence, not two, even though this is an abbreviation, which I'll get to in a future video. It would not be AM period, period. Only one period ends a sentence. So in this case, this period from this abbreviation ends the sentence. Lynn asked, what time does the next ferry leave? Question mark. So it's no space before, and then you say, well, hold on, it's one space after, but remember, no space after a question mark when it's followed by a closing quotation mark, so then no space. And the last example is a decimal point. At the last weight loss meeting, I lost 2.3 pounds. So this is a decimal point, so it's no space before, remember, and then no space after the decimal point. Oh, I forgot this one, period. So no space before. This should be red. Maybe this one should be red, but I was using it as an example in abbreviation. So next rule, rule 55, no space before, but one space after a comma, colon, or semicolon. No space before, one space after. But of course, there's exceptions. And the exceptions are no space after a comma when, and then these situations within a number. So remember, it's one space after, but no space after if it's within a number for a comma. Or when it's followed by a closing quotation mark. There's actually examples of that in Rule 54. And the next exception is no space after colon when it's within an expression of time, so like 9:30 a.m. So here you have a colon, and since it's within an expression of time, there's no space after. Or for a ratio, or between the volume and page number of a book series. So like Computer Networks 3/174, this actually means Computer Networks Volume 3, page 174. Say to write that, so no space after the colon if it's showing volume and page number within a book series. Then between chapter and verse of the Bible, so Genesis 1:1, so this would be Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. So no, you have a colon here, there's no space after the colon. So let's look at some examples. Before you mail the package, comma, so remember no space before and one space after, please stop at the bank and withdraw $1,000. So this comma here, though, you'd say, oh, there's supposed to be a space after the comma, but no space after a comma when it's within a number. So this comma, because it's within a number, no space. But this comma, yes. No space before, one space after. A ferry will cross the river in an hour, comma, closing quotation mark, Lynn said. So it's the rule is no space before the comma, which we did. You say, well, hold on, it's one space after, but the exception was if there's a closing quotation mark. It's followed by a closing quotation mark. So we have comma, closing quotation mark, there's no space after, Lynn said. The children arrived at school around 9:30 a.m., semicolon. So there's no space before and one space after for semicolon. The bus had a flat tire. I dislike one thing, mean people. So you have one thing, colon. So for colon, remember no space before, one space after. That's what we have here. Mix the powder and water in a 5:2 ratio. So this colon here. So there's so when you have a colon and it's used in a ratio, there's no space after the colon for ratio. The authors did not fully explain why they quoted Genesis 1:1 and Computer Networks 3:174. So this contains two rules. Remember, no space after colon when it's separating Bible chapter and verse, or when separating a book series, volume, and page number, which this is. So you have a colon, but there's no space after these colons due to being a chapter, verse in Bible, or volume and page number in a book series. So rule 56, no space before or after, so before or after, a dash, slash, or hyphen. And the exceptions are one space after a suspending hyphen. If you want to see, I don't think I have an example of that, but if you want to see examples, click on video 44 and go to rule 44. One space after, before and after a slash, when an alternative is an open compound, or when separating lines of poetry. So Generally no slash before and after, or no space after a slash, but when the alternative is an open compound or separating lines of poetry, do use a space before and after. So go see video 47 of Rule 53. So here's some examples, because I believe I don't have any examples of this last bullet in this video. Just go back, or just go to this, click on this video, go to this rule to see some examples. The punctuation videos are a win-win solution. So here it is a hyphen, and there's no space before and after. He said, quote, slash, unquote, fire, get out. So here we have a slash, and there's no space before and after a slash. And here's an example of using a dash. The affected nations, dash, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, dash, sign the trade agreement. So there's no space before or after a dash. So Rule 57 is use one space before and no space after an opening quotation mark, opening parentheses, or opening bracket. So for an opening, if you're doing an open, opening quotation mark, parentheses, or bracket, then it's one space before, no space after. And then for a closing quotation mark, closing parentheses, and closing bracket, it's no space before and one space after. And of course, there's always some exceptions. Is no space after a closing, a closing quotation mark, parentheses, or bracket when another punctuation mark immediately follows. So if you have one of these closing marks and you have another punctuation mark, there's no space after it. So some examples. Did he really say, quote, I love you, unquote, question mark? So here you have, an opening parentheses. So there's one space before, which we have, no space after. And then for the closing, there's no space before, and then it says one space after. But hold on, you're saying, but there's no space here. Why is there not a space between this closing quotation mark and the question mark? It's because this exception is that after a closing mark, if you have another punctuation mark which immediately follows, then there's no space after. So they go right, they're immediately adjacent to each other. Next example, the eviction notice has an error, 60, parentheses, opening parentheses 30, close parentheses, quotation mark, days. So here, once again, here you have the opening quotation mark, so one space before, no spaces after, and then you get to the parentheses, open parentheses, one space before, no space after, this closing parentheses, no space before. You say, well, hold on, there's supposed to be a space after, but once again, the exception is if a punctuation mark immediately follows one of these closing marks, then there's no space after. So that's the reason why it's parentheses and quotation marks are immediately adjacent to each other, because of this exception. And then days. I believe this is the last example, is, quote, I married that year, 2017, which is in brackets, closing quotation mark, Cody replied. So here, starting here, opening quotation mark. Remember, there's no space after. No space after. Then you have I married that year. Then you have this bracket. So the opening bracket is one space before, no space after, which we have. Then you have the closing one, which is no space before, one space after, but you're saying, hold on, there's immediately a punctuation mark. But once again, saying the exceptions is if you have one of these closing bracket, there's no space if you have an immediate if a punctuation mark immediately follows, so you put immediately, and then you're saying, well, hold on, why isn't there a space after this comma? Because we know it's, for a comma, it's no space before, one space after, remember that exception was there's no space after comma unless there's a closing quotation mark right after it. So here you actually have three punctuation marks all together. Closing bracket, comma, closing quotation mark, all together with no spacing. Cody replied, period. So that's it for this video. If you'd like to get notifications for this series, please click subscribe. If you like the video, please hit like. Check out links to books and videos in the description.